Thank you. Senator Harris.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I believe that there is bipartisan consensus that the American tax system does need reform. But unfortunately, that's where the consensus in this process has ended. What we are witnessing is a process that is not thoughtful, it is not responsible, and it is not fair. And that is troubling. Senator King mentioned before the historic 1986 tax reform, the Senate Finance Committee held 33 days of hearings. On this bill, the Senate Finance Committee has not held a single hearing to consider the merits of these policies. This bill is being rushed through with no attempt at bipartisanship. And if we held hearings, the American people would learn that this tax plan cuts taxes to corporations and the top 1% of Americans. And it pays for those tax cuts in two ways: by adding to the deficit and by raising taxes on middle-class families. So let's unpack the elements that have been proposed in the House and Senate plan. And let's ask the question, who does this tax plan help? And who does it hurt? Under this bill, if you're a middle-class family, you could be one of the 50 million American households who will see a tax increase within a decade. That's 5.8 million California households. Under this bill, 572,000 taxpayers who make over $1 million a year will get $34 billion in tax cuts in a single year. Under this bill, if you're a firefighter or a police officer, this tax plan would risk the funding to your station by taking away the state and local tax deduction. If you care about public schools where you live, this tax plan will risk millions of dollars for public education in your state by taking away the state and local deduction. If you're a senior relying on Medicare, the tax plan would slash Medicare by up to $410 billion over a decade. Over $45 billion of those tax cuts would hit California. And because Senate Republicans couldn't repeal the Affordable Care Act, they're trying to turn this tax bill into a health care bill by repealing the individual mandate. So that means if you have health insurance, you could be one of 13 million people to become uninsured in the next decade, or face premium increases of up to 10%. And if you worry about burdening your children with debt, like I know certainly most Democrats and many of our Republican friends do care about, be clear, this tax plan would increase the deficit by $1.4 trillion by the year 2027. And the House tax plan, which will be conferenced with the Senate bill, does even more harm to everyday Americans. If you're a teacher, the GOP tax plan takes away your deduction to buy your students' school supplies. If you're a veteran, it takes away a tax incentive to hire you and others who have defended our country. If you have student loans, the plan would eliminate the benefit that allows you to deduct the interest on your loans from the taxes you pay. If you lost everything in the California wildfires, this tax plan takes away your ability to write off losses to your property. Now let's talk about who this tax bill helps. If your estate is worth more than $5.5 million, under this tax plan, you'd pay a lot less taxes on that estate. If you're the top 0.1% of Americans, you get almost $100,000 in tax cuts per year. If you run a corporation, this plan permanently cuts corporate tax rates from 35% to 20%, even though corporate profits have gone up and while wages for working Americans stagnated. And I want to be clear, in this great country, we celebrate success. We don't want to penalize those who have done well. But we also believe that folks who have been blessed can contribute a bit more to paying for the things that benefit us all. And I don't think it's fair to jack up the deficit or pull the rug out from the middle class to give a bit more to those who already have so much. So here's my suggestion. Instead of giving corporations a big tax cut, let's give the middle class a real tax cut. Instead of giving Americans most fortunate more tax breaks, let's ask them to make a contribution a little bit more to help invest in infrastructure and job training and making college affordable. Instead of playing politics with people's lives, let's listen to the American people who have spoken loud and clear. Let's listen to Americans like the teacher from Irvine who wrote me and said, quote, "The 1% do not need this tax benefit. They need to pay more of their fair share. We need to preserve what's left of the middle class and make it possible for others to achieve that status." It's regrettable that our colleagues have not voted to reject this bill. I truly believe this does not reflect the best of who we are as a country. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you look around this committee room, it really is a reflection of what's been broken about this process. Vote first, debate, although obviously that's not what we're having, a debate later, people who don't want to have their ideas tested against one another. I can tell you lots of my Republican colleagues are quietly telling us that they understand the great damage that parts of this bill can do. And yet there's this mad rush to get it done simply for political purposes. And as my colleagues say, and we say this in good faith, I believe there's going to be grave damage throughout the country for years to come if this bill actually passes. Now, the core of the House and the Senate tax bills are a major cut in the corporate tax rate from 35% to 20%. We could have a good discussion about reforming the corporate tax code because right now we know some corporations pay near the high end of that and some pay virtually zero. And there's a great discussion to be had about how you make that more fair among corporations without asking middle-class taxpayers to pay for that tax cut and without increasing the debt. And what's the theory behind this big drop in the corporate tax rate? It's a trickle-down theory, the idea that corporations are going to have all this new money and they're going to give their workers a pay raise. It's a big problem with that. We've tried that in the past in one form or another. We've tried trickle-down economics. It ran aground in the real world in the early 2000s. What went up were the incomes of the already wealthy. Everybody else was stuck running in place or falling behind. And the deficits went way up as well. And the notion that corporations who right now are making record profits but not passing those profits on to their employees in the form of higher wages, the idea that giving them another windfall, a tax break, is all of a sudden going to make them say, okay, now we're going to give our employees a wage increase, is belied by what's happening right now in America. And if you also look at the reporting from Reuters and others, CEOs are telling us that that's not what they're going to do with the money. They're going to use that money for stock paybacks. They're going to use that money for some dividends. And by the way, 1/3 of the stockholders of these corporations, 1/3, in fact, a little more than that, 35%, are foreigners. Foreign stockholders are going to get a $31 billion tax cut in 2019 alone. That's money going right out of the country into the pockets of very wealthy foreigners. On top of all that, it's going to make a bad situation even worse. It is going to incentivize more American businesses to move their jobs overseas. Mr. Chairman, I really ask you to look at this part of the tax plan, because when previous territorial plans were reviewed, there was at least some attempt to prevent the perverse effect of having more American businesses move overseas by applying a minimum tax at least on a country-by-country basis. Don't do that in this bill. There is a new incentive to move jobs, American jobs, from Baltimore, from your state, to places around the world. That's insane. So who's going to pay for it? As my colleagues have said, there are three big sources. One are middle-class taxpayers. In my state of Maryland, one quarter of Marylanders are going to see their taxes go up, middle-class families. You're going to see a bunch that get a small tax break for a couple of years, then it's going to go up because, as has been said, you've got permanent tax breaks for corporations and very small tax breaks for some Americans. But in my state of Maryland, like 1/4 of our taxpayers are going to immediately see a tax increase in a bill that's been sold as a middle-class tax break. How does that compute? We're also going to see our children and grandchildren paying more through the national debt, $1.5 trillion. I sat next to Paul Ryan for years. One of the things we actually agreed on was the risks over time of an escalating national debt. It's bad for the economy. We've heard from former Fed chairs, Bernanke, Yellen. We had the nominee Powell in banking this morning. He agreed. You've had long-term debts. You're going to actually slow down economic growth in the long run. And it's our kids who are going to pay for it both ways. And then finally, as ranking members Sanders and others have pointed out repeatedly, once those debts start going way up, we know our Republican colleagues are going to somehow rediscover the religion of the problem of escalating debts. And then they're going to come right around and go, oh my God, we got to cut Medicare, we got to cut Medicaid, we got to cut education. And that's not speculation. It's right there in the budget that came out of this committee earlier. $1 trillion cut to Medicaid over 10 years in the budget. We're not doing that part of the budget now. This is the old two-step. $473 billion cut to Medicare in the budget. Cuts to education in the budget. So it's not speculation that once the debt goes way through the roof by another $1.5 trillion, our Republican colleagues are going to rediscover religion and come after those programs, even though they say they're not now. So, Mr. Chairman, I really ask you in the coming days, let's get back to a conversation. We may not agree on everything at the end of the day, but let's at least have a debate and not speak to empty rooms all day long. Thank you.